Normally, I'm not disappointed in whoever selected the scope of our Sunday readings, but I am today. We're presented for our first reading with what seems like a perfectly ordinary account of Paul and Barnabas' first mission trip as they finish up and return to Antioch. But there is so much more that we just missed. We only hear it in the first readings tomorrow and Tuesday, and never on a Sunday. Here's what we missed. Paul and Barnabas arrived at Lystra, the town where they start in our reading. And Paul, seeing a crippled man filled with faith, cried out, "Stand up straight on your feet." And the man was cured. Paul clearly hoped this miracle would help convince the people of his preaching and the truth of it. However, the pagan crowd came to a different conclusion. They decided that Paul and Barnabas were Greek gods in human form and started calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, the messenger and often the spokesman of the gods. The pagan priests brought oxen and garlands, and the people were ready to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. At this, they tore their garments in frustration and tried to explain to them that they were not these false gods, but mere human messengers of the true God. Even so, Luke tells us they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. Then, just 2 verses before our reading began, verses that I think could easily have been included today, Luke writes, "However, some Jews from Antioch and Iconium arrived and won over the crowds. They stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered around him, he got up and entered the city. On the following day, he left with Barnabas for Derbe." So it seems that Paul left Lystra after being stoned and presumed dead, and then after a visit to Derbe, he returned to Lystra for our reading. And standing in front of the people who had probably stoned him, he was probably as well still bruised and cut. He said what we heard today. "It is necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God." That line has a little more weight with this picture in mind. But in addition to missing the action, there's also an interesting parallel that we can now see between Paul's whole experience and our gospel today. First, remember where we are in our gospel. It begins with Judas leaving the Last Supper to prepare for his betrayal of Jesus. But not long before this, Jesus was entering the city of Jerusalem on Palm Sunday in a triumphant procession, with people singing his praise and laying palms beneath the feet of his donkey. And then, much like Paul, the crowd went from praise to murder with surprising speed. And also like Paul, Jesus highlights this sudden turn in what we hear today. Again, Paul told us, it is necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And Jesus tells the apostles that God is going to glorify the Son of Man at once. This should seem strange. The glorification of the Son of Man by God himself is not when all the crowds were trying to glorify him. It was when the crowds were about to kill him. This is because the glory of God is not just who he is, but it is that his love is so great that God himself is willing to die for us. There's a beautiful scene in the movie The Passion of the Christ that, through some artistic license, connects our second reading to our other readings today. In the movie, as Mary encounters Jesus carrying the cross on the road to Calvary, he looks at her and says, "See, Mother, I make all things new." Much like our second reading, which says, "Behold, I make all things new." I think the movie understood it perfectly in this case. This is the moment that God was letting the old order pass away and making all things new. The heavenly Jerusalem still awaits us, but since the cross, we are no longer bound to that old order. When our world thinks about summarizing how Jesus told us to live, we too often think only of the golden rule. Jesus told them, "Do to others whatever you would have them do to you. This is the law and the prophets. Or we think of when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was. And he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. But these are coming from the old law, and Jesus came to fulfill the old law. Countless times in his preaching, he commanded us to go above and beyond the precepts of the old law. And here in this gospel, he is asking us to go beyond those familiar laws. As I have loved you, so you also should love one another. How did he love us? To death. That kind of radical love will inevitably lead to many hardships, as Paul knew all too well. But it is also what will make it impossible for the world not to notice that there is something profoundly different about the followers of Christ.